All right, well, welcome everybody to our town hall for the National Minority Alliance. We have a new name. It's not on our slide here. We're now the National Minority Health Alliance. The topic today is a very important one, something I think we all have been thinking about and talking about for the last year and a half at least, and that's the considerations of the use of race and ethnicity in clinical research. I think certainly because of COVID and because of other issues that have brought to light inequities in health and healthcare and health-related research, a really important topic for us to delve into. I'm really pleased to be joined by Dr. Kevin Shah, Assistant Professor of Medicine, Heart Failure and Transplant Cardiology, and Director of the Cardiovascular ICU at the University of Utah Health, and Ms. Annette Flanagin, Executive Managing Editor and Vice President for Editorial Operations at the Journal of the American Medical Association and the Journal of the American Medical Association Network. I'm David Kountz. I'm a general internist at Hackensack Meridian Health in New Jersey. So that's me, and this is our organization, and we're really proud to have the opportunity to host this program. We are a not-for-profit organization committed to eliminating minority and cardiovascular health disparities. And as I mentioned, we are really in the process of broadening our scope, focusing still on Black African Americans, Hispanic Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans. Our work considers the influence of culture, genetics, and the social determinants of health on cardiovascular and moving forward on all aspects of health. We are guided by a steering committee. We had a steering committee meeting yesterday, and hopefully some of those steering committee members are joining us today. So I think this is a really important concept, just stated in this one sentence on the slide, that we are really here to ask critical questions, to really better understand different points of view, different perspectives. I personally think having a physician and a journalist, editorialist with us today to share those perspectives is really terrific. And again, I thank them for joining us. So, boy, I think all of us could think back both in our professional lives and our personal lives about how we have grown up thinking about what race and ethnicity means, and particularly in thinking about in the context of medicine. As the slide reveals, we do try to be as precise as possible. But we talk about race and ethnicity in a very imprecise fashion. Sometimes it's related to one thing or the other, and it's very hard to get our arms around race as a social construct or not as a social construct. But if it is a social construct, why do we include a race adjustment in clinical algorithms? Something that's a very provocative topic. Why do we adjust kidney function or pulmonary function because of race if it's just a social construct? The majority of medical outcomes are most affected by social determinants of health. If there's one thing we've learned from COVID, it is the importance of zip code, perhaps over genetic code and the other social determinants. And the classification of race has an impact on negative outcomes and inequities. As a faculty member at a medical school, we're often discussing with our students and residents, should we talk about race in part of the clinical presentation? Does it create bias, or does it create a better awareness potentially of social determinants? So lots of challenging questions to ask. This a little bit of history on the slide. I'm not going to read every bullet, but the biological concept of race goes back for a very long time, based largely on physical differences, and particularly in the last several hundred years. And if you ever attend a talk on systemic racism in this country, you, I think, are very familiar with those physical differences which were used as a rationale for the differences in races. The social construct also goes back, probably not quite as long, but key points as noted here: the origin of species, and then race associated with frequency of genetic variation. So the definitions will always be arbitrary and associated with different systemic hierarchies. So ethnicity is a separate but related construct dating back to the late 1700s, referring to a person's cultural identity, language, customs, and religion, and a definition provided as membership of a group regarded as ultimately of common descendant or having a common natural or cultural tradition. So can we define race and ethnicity? And should we define race and ethnicity in medicine? Can we get to a point where we all are speaking the same language, where we approach social determinants, biological differences with a common and agreed to set of principles? So how and why are our questions to ponder for this webinar. So with that, let me turn it over to Dr. Kevin Shah, who I introduced a few minutes ago, for his remarks. And Dr. Shah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Dr. Kountz, and thank you for your team for organizing this really important discussion. I do have some research funding from my university studying COVID-19 in the heart, and I have served on an advisory board for Amgen, which is actually trying to tackle this issue about representation in clinical trials. So a little bit of background, this is an area that I will start off by saying I'm far from an expert in critical race theory or anything in that space. I'm a heart failure transplant cardiologist who's very involved in clinical research. And this area in particular became interesting to me back when I was in training because I noticed it was really hard to find granular data on specific groups, whether they're individuals from India or individuals from Russia. And so we started digging into this and we put together a team, a project, a manuscript that I'm going to highlight for you guys as we go through the slides. The history of this, as Dr. Kountz had mentioned earlier, a lot of the initial categorization that's used in clinical research lends itself from government organizations. So the Office of Management and Budget, the FDA, Department of HHS, in the 80s and 90s, they put forth kind of these broader groups to use to categorize individuals. And then from there, a lot of clinical research use those categories to say, this is how we'll study individuals. I think we can all acknowledge there's a strong relationship between disparities, social determinants of health, and currently used racial and ethnic categories. There's a less strong relationship between biologic causes of disease and response to therapies when you compare them with these social constructs or race and ethnicity. And really, if one of the goals of clinical research is to study the biologic causes of disease, having a more standardized approach and how we collect data on both race, ethnicity, ancestry, and then importantly, reporting that data to study it would really be a step forward for us to better understand this issue. This is one figure that's from the Institute of Medicine that I think is an important framework to think through these issues. This concept of, on the y-axis is just quality of healthcare going up. And there's two groups here, which are really the underrepresented racial and ethnic groups, which is what UREG stands for, as compared to the non-underrepresented racial and ethnic groups. And there's a clear difference in terms of their care and their quality of healthcare. And the differences, part of that are due, frankly, to disparities, specifically the systems they operate in, and then these concepts of discrimination, biases, stereotyping, and uncertainty. But there's also this difference that exists that's not necessarily due just to the delivery of care, but also what's appropriate for that person in terms of their potential biologic ancestry, and then the patient's needs and their preferences. So this is an effort that a lot of us put our heads on. Most of the people here are involved as cardiologists, clinical trialists, and individuals from the Food and Drug Administration, from a few different areas actually, all put their heads together, registry leaders, to say how can we move this field a little bit forward. Within this, the basic background, as I mentioned earlier, is this assignment of individuals to racial or ethnic categories. When you look at least contemporary cardiovascular research, most often it's from clinical research teams assigning individuals or using electronic health record data in which individuals are assigned to groups and extracting that information. Some studies will actually provide the opportunity for self-reporting of race and ethnicity, but from what we found, this is a small percentage of contemporary research. As I mentioned earlier, there's different disease patterns within these groups. And one area that has always stood out to me personally, but it stands out to a lot that study this issue, is these groups that are most often used are very broad. For example, this is on the right is a paper published a few years ago now that was specifically trying to disaggregate a group of Asians. So to say, if we try to ferret out country of origin amongst Asians, can we see differences? And on this particular figure, the top is females, the bottom is males, the y-axis is proportionate mortality ratio for cardiovascular disease. And when they separated by separate groups, what they found were certain groups, Asian Indians, Filipinos, a higher proportionate mortality from ischemic heart disease as compared to other groups such as Vietnamese, Japanese individuals. And so when you lump together as a broad group like Asian, you lose the granularity to try to ferret out which groups may benefit from individualized therapy or personalized care. So we did do a little bit of a deep dive into studies, two different groups. One are studies that actually tried, or at least made some specific effort to focus on particular populations, whether it's defined by race or ethnicity or even ancestry. And there are some very well-known studies that attempt to do this. This includes AllHat, which was a prevention study focusing on hypertension management. And it was a somewhat well-represented cohort. There was about 32% African Americans, and there were pre-specified subgroup analyses focusing on individuals of that background. Similarly, AHEF, which is one of the larger heart failure studies. This was a study that actually specifically enrolled individuals who self-identified as African American and asked a question about a therapeutic to see if it would improve outcomes in patients with heart failure. Other studies more recently, one known as the Masala study, probably one of the better acronyms you'll see for a study. This is a cohort that started in 2013, primarily based out of San Francisco and Chicago. This is studying sort of a parallel to a Framingham type study, but really focusing on South Asians who live in the US to figure out the risk factors to develop cardiovascular disease. And as you move down, MESA, ARIC, Jackson Heart Study, MESA and ARIC are two very well-known NHLBI studies that try to answer these questions about cardiovascular disease, atherosclerotic disease, and have specific focus on race and ethnicity. One of the issues that came up is how much reporting actually occurs, right? Because a lot of studies, particularly more contemporary studies, do make an active effort, and in a lot of the trial data, they have a goal of enrolling diverse populations, not just racial ethnic backgrounds, but also representing both sex as well. And there is a discrepancy between the populations enrolled in trial and probably the composition of the patient, of the actual population that we take care of as clinicians. So on the right, this is a table. We looked at specifically the two of the larger cardiovascular scientific sessions, the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association. Every year they have late-breaking clinical clinical where they'll present at least data that more often than not goes on to publication in large journals. And we looked at the total number of late-breaking clinical trials, which was around 20 each year. And going from the top to bottom, each row is just each year for each major meeting. And going to the right, each column is the late-breaking trial reporting any racial or ethnic categories. And again, this was during the actual presentation at the scientific session. A small percentage would actually report racial ethnic data. So as you can see, around 20, 30, 40%, total 35%. Detailed racial ethnic categorization. So this is anything broader than white, black, and the very illustrative other. That was about 18%. And then a pre-specified subgroup analysis was a very small percentage of these studies, the 6%. This is, just one sample of potentially areas where just as a community, we could do a little bit better. Now, some of these trials go on to publication, and within the publication, they may report the data, but at least at initial presentation, there seems to be there does not seem to be an emphasis on presenting this data. So how to actually do this a little bit better? This was one area that was frankly, probably the most challenging aspect of this effort. And I think some of the data or some of the work that Annette's going to present really lends itself to how to do a better job of this. So we acknowledge that there's a lot of heterogeneity within these broad groups. We said, well, if you report everyone's country of origin, or at least self-identified country of origin, that would provide some granularity, but potentially too much information because there's so many countries that could potentially be represented. And the issue of mixed race comes into play as well. So we did emphasize this concept of race, ethnicity. They capture important information, can't throw the quote unquote baby out with the bathwater just yet. But this idea of geographic origin or regionalization, when it's known, providing that information that this person is from this ancestry or this part of the world, it would at least provide a step forward in terms of a better understanding of origin of ancestry. And until we get to the stage, which we're not at yet, in which every trial participant has their genetic code provided for investigation, this is probably an intermediary step where we can better understand this association between where people originate from and why they have the diseases that they do. We'll hand it over to Annette.
Great. Let me introduce Annette in just a second, but let me remind all of you, first of all, thank you, Dr. Shah, for a terrific presentation, very thought-provoking. Why don't we hold questions, if that's all right? And when we finish with Ms. Flanagan's presentation, we can either unmute, which is fine. You can raise your hand in the bar, pressing that button on the bottom of the Zoom screen, or put a question in the chat. So we really want you to be part of this discussion today. Annette Flanagin is Executive Managing Editor and Vice President of Editorial Operations for JAMA and the JAMA Network. All of us involved in medicine know of the Journal of the American Medical Association. It has what's called a very high impact factor. When you get something in JAMA, it means that everyone around the world is reading it. So to have the executive managing editor join us is quite a thrill. Annette, let me ask you to take it away.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kountz, and thank you to you and Jessica Seafried and the Alliance for this opportunity to talk about something that is really important to us. And I think it's a great opportunity to hear from you all about this guidance that we are going to be continually updating. So yeah, I am a journalist, Dr. Kountz. I'm a medical journalist, but I'm also a cardiology nurse by training. So Dr. Shah and I have a bit of an affinity there. I'm going to be talking about reporting guidance for race and ethnicity in publishing in medical and science and health journals. And it's going to be based primarily on the AMA Manual of Style. So the AMA Manual of Style is a online resource, a 1,200-page reference book that provides tools, guidance, nuts and bolts for authors and editors, everything from data presentation and guidance on statistics and methods to the nuts and bolts of grammar and medical nomenclature. And we have a particular section on inclusive language that we've had for a while. This book is in its 11th edition. And for this edition, we had revised the subsection on reporting in race and ethnicity. But we found shortly thereafter that it needed to be updated again. These are my disclosures. I think we've already discussed them. I'll just take for a second. There we go. So what was our goal in updating this guidance? We believe that it is imperative for publications and for authors of publications in medical and science journals to use equitable and consistent language when discussing race and ethnicity of patients, of study participants, or of populations and people in general. And as we state here, and we stated in the intro to our updated guidance, terminology usage and word choice are critically important, especially when describing people and when discussing race and ethnicity. Inclusive language supports diversity, conveys respect. Language that imparts bias toward or against persons or groups based on characteristics or demographics must be avoided. So what was our process? We have a committee that meets regularly, especially during the revision of a book. And so we met for 4 or 5 years before the 11th edition. We continue to meet. And in the spring of 2020, following the killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and so many others, it became clear that we needed to make an immediate change. And that was with the consistent capitalization of all terms referring to racial and ethnic categories. And I'm going to get to that in a few minutes. This was an 8-month process of research, updating the guidance, getting external review from experts in the area. And then we did something we'd never done before. In February of this year, we published an editorial with the updated guidance in JAMA, because we knew it was a large platform, and we invited public review and feedback. And we got a lot of feedback from scholars in this area, in researchers who report on race and ethnicity and disparities, but also people who work outside of medicine in the diversity, equity, and inclusion area. And of course, whenever you have more than 2 people, many of them disagreed on how we would handle some terms. For instance, terms such as how to handle people of color as a term, or the word minoritized as a term. And I'll get into that again, but there was quite a lot of disagreement about what we should be doing with those. Key principles in the updated guidance include what you see here on the screen. And I think we've discussed how important it is that race and ethnicity are social constructs, and both the presentations before me got to that. And we recognize that. And we also recognize that there is limited utility in understanding medical research and practice through these constructs, but the terms can be useful as a lens through which to study and view racism and disparities and inequities in health and healthcare, in health practice, and in policy. So these constructs, they're indistinct, they are socially derived, and it's being progressively and increasingly acknowledged they are problematic. And that's one of the main reasons we went forward with this guidance, and it's a key principle that will drive our continual review and updating them. Second, there will be historical sensitivities and controversies related to the language used to describe race and ethnicity, and we think it's paramount that authors and editors are clear, precise, fair, and consistent in the terms used. Third, race and racism do not exist in isolation, as my colleagues have just described, and therefore racial and ethnic descriptors should not be reported alone. Other socio-demographic factors and context, social determinants are important, and that intersectionality is very, very important to be recognized and to be dealt with. Fourth, it should be very clear that who or what classified a participant in terms of race and ethnicity is needed to be transparently reported in any article. And whether that's self-report or selection through some survey mechanism, investigator observed, or use of a database or electronic health record, we also are encouraging, wherever possible, self-identification. And of course, that's one of the big issues that we're dealing here. And lastly, this guidance is not final. It will be continually reviewed as terms and language for reporting race and ethnicity and societal norms continue to evolve, which I hope they will. The guidance has several components, which you can see listed here. First, in terms of the definitions, our original guidance relied on archaic terms from dictionaries that are well known to you all that have not yet been updated. So we had to really move away from that and look towards more outside of dictionaries to scholars who have done work in the DEI area primarily. We acknowledge that these terms are going to continue to change, that some are out of date, and this nomenclature will continue to evolve. Concerns and controversies in healthcare and research, including the intersectionality of ancestry and heritage, social determinants of health, and other socioeconomic and social, structural, institutional, cultural, and demographic factors are very important to acknowledge. As was noted, the use of race, for instance, to estimate GFR among Black adults has become controversial for many reasons. And there have been, in the last year, good guidance on how to move away from that. Other examples have been reviewed just recently by Dr. Shah. And there's similar concerns about genetic risk studies based on specific populations that don't include participants from other groups. For instance, GWAS studies that report associations on specific diseases, but are based only on a population of participants of European descent. We also address capitalization, abbreviations, and we have now specifically recommended that any racial or ethnic categories that are presented in a report of research be listed in alphabetical order, not by order of majority. And that's a big change, but many are beginning to do it. We have guidance on adjectival and noun usage for categories. I'll explain that. And we have a good section on considerations of geographic origin and regionalization. And we're providing examples to help authors and editors move forward. So first, as I mentioned, the first change we made was to capitalize the B and the W in Black and white. For years, those terms in almost every style guide that you might see, whether it be the AMA style guide, the APA style guide, the Chicago Manual of Style, or whatever you might be using, did not capitalize these terms, which was inconsistent with other terms based on geographic origins, such as Asian or regional origin, Asian, Hispanic. So that was the first change we made. And that, unfortunately, was relatively simple. But the other changes that I'm going to show here took much more time. And that's what that 8-month process involved. Next example here, we used to commonly put a virgule or a forward slash between race and ethnicity, group them together. This is an area that is still evolving and is still quite controversial, but because the virgule can mean and or, and that can be confusing, we are now suggesting that that not be used in this context. We are also encouraging, as I mentioned, alpha order of the categories, with other or unknown being listed last. We recommend that the terms for race and ethnicity not be presented alone as nouns, so not to call people Asians or whites, but to actually recognize in what context this racial or ethnic category is modifying the person, Asian patient, Black individual, or white population. We remind people that hyphens are not used in terms of combinations to describe different racial or ethnic categories, as the examples show here, including when they're a compound modifier, such as African American patient. We also remind authors who are focused on research in a US context not to routinely put the word American before a particular population unless it's a term that is well recognized and used in research, again, such as African American. But the term Asian American may not apply, or the term Cuban American may not apply, for example. Mixed race. This is one of the areas where there's some practical problems. So the term is in some governmental or regional areas a formal term, for instance, in the UK. But it may carry negative connotations, so we need to be careful about how it's used, and it should be defined if it is used. We're recommending terms such as multiracial or multi-ethnic in its stead. I'll give you an example of a particular problem that we ran into that I think had a good solution. In June, JAMA Cardiology published a study titled Association of Novel Locus with Rheumatoid Heart Disease in Black African individuals. This was a study of 8 African countries. And when they got to describing the population from South Africa, which, as you know, has an interesting history in terms of its evolution, of at least in terminology, still has in its official government lexicon the term South African coloreds. So when that term was in a manuscript, the manuscript editor came to me and said, you know, I feel like this is potentially offensive. I'm not sure what we should do. I said, well, why don't you ask the authors what that group comprises? And she did. And the definition was comprising any admixture combination of European, Southeast Asian, South Asian, Bantu-speaking African and/or indigenous Southern African hunter-gatherer ancestry. So that was very clear what it was describing. And we ended up actually not using the word coloreds, but describing what was in that group. And then the authors agreed to use the term admixed African individuals as the term in the paper. We checked that out actually with the managing editor of the South African Medical Journal, and they said that that was actually a term that they were moving towards. So we felt like we had a good reason for that. Abbreviations, we generally try to avoid abbreviations for race and ethnicity because some of them actually AA, for instance, for African American, have other terms that could be confusing for people. And our journals and most of your research will be read internationally, and these abbreviations are not well understood. So we suggest that they not be used. The term minority and minorities, this is another area where we had a lot of discussion and some disagreement. And we ended up with the recommendation not to use the word minority alone, because it could be inaccurate, it could be stigmatizing, and it may not be clear. So we're recommending, and it's a cumbersome set of words, but racial and ethnic minority groups. Why? Because there are other minority groups that might be in that status because of sex or gender, socioeconomic status, or other variables. In addition, we define the difference between the term underserved population when referring to health disparities among groups, and underrepresented population when referring to a disproportionately low number of individuals, for example, in the workforce or in an educational program. The term minoritized can be used as an adjective, provided that its modifiers are clear. And we've also seen phrases such as groups that have been historically marginalized. We did quite a lot of research on the term people of color, which was introduced as a term of anti-racist, multiracial solidarity in the 1970s. But there's concern growing that the term may be too inclusive to the point that it erases differences among specific groups. And we actually cite reports and guidance from individuals who represent backgrounds as a Black person in the UK, an Asian man, and a Hispanic writer to support their concern about the use of that term. So we're recommending preference for the specific racial or ethnic categories to be included and to be described. And again, we use collective terms such as racial and ethnic minority groups, and are encouraging people to identify what makes up those specifics, the subgroups that are included. Similarly, the commonly used acronyms BIPOC or BAME, BAME is used commonly in the UK. There's similar criticisms that these terms should be avoided because they disregard individuals' identities. They don't include all underrepresented groups. They eliminate differences among groups, and they may imply a hierarchy among them. In this case, we are also recommending a collective term such as racial and ethnic minority group, and encouraging that the subgroups that are within that be defined carefully. Black and brown is a colloquialism that you're often seeing. We're encouraging authors not to use those terms because they, again, could be misunderstood. They may not be inclusive enough. They may be insensitive, and in some cases, they might be considered a racial slur. The term other, Dr. Shah talked about this in his presentation. The term other needs to be defined, and we see it all of the time. So we're asking authors to be as specific as possible about what groups are included in that bucket of other. If the numbers in some of these categories of others are so small, which is common to potentially identify study participants, the specific numbers or percentages of those subcategories don't need to be included, say in the table 1, but to define them in a legend of what we're to the table would I think would be helpful and more transparent. And for cases in which the group other is not defined, the author should be queried, and we do query them to ask if they could be more transparent about that. A lot of discussion about terms that represent people who are Spanish speaking or have an ethnic origin from a country or region that is Spanish speaking. And the terms you see here, Hispanic, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latin, are commonly used. Different researchers will use different terms. Obviously, in this country, if you're following US Census or NIH, Hispanic is a common term, or non-Hispanic is a common term. So we're just asking people to use the terms that were used in their studies and to explain what they mean. A lot of information about regional descent and recognizing how important that is. I think this is an area, as Dr. Shah alluded to, that is going to continue to become very, very important. And we may be heading towards a time when surveys are actually broken into two parts, and you're first asking for someone's country of origin or regional descent before you're actually going to ask for them to identify a specific race or ethnic category. The term Native American is now preferred to be used with the terms American Indian or Alaska Native, and there are other terms that can be used as well. With Indigenous or Aboriginal, we want them to be not used alone, but again, to recognize that these are people, so Indigenous people, Indigenous peoples of Canada, Aboriginal people, and so on. A lot of concern about biological explanations for healthcare and disparities, as Dr. Kountz gave us a very short on what is a very deep history about the problems for that. Many examples of reported associations between race and ethnicity and health outcomes are available, but these outcomes are clearly intertwined with other issues, as we've been discussing. So we're advising the use of caution in any reports that are looking at biologic or genetic markers, risks, or associations for health outcomes. We are or have updated the instructions for authors in all of our journals. This is a very short summary of everything that I've just gone over, but these instructions are kind of giving authors a snapshot overview of what we're expecting. That the methods section should include an explanation of who identified the participant race, ethnicity, and the source of the classification, again, with preference for self-identification if possible. That the reasons that these were assessed should be described. That's really important because you're probably going to have a little discussion about what this means in terms of the outcomes in the discussion section of the study. We prefer specific racial and ethnic categories over collective terms whenever possible. We're reminding people of that. We're reminding to list them in alpha order. We're reminding them to tell us who's in the other group, and to be careful to also report the findings by race and ethnicity if they were studied in the results section of the article. We began disseminating this guidance. We published an editorial, a second editorial with the updated guidance in JAMA on August 17th. And there's a link there to it. It's freely available. We have added this guidance to the inclusive language section of the AMA manual style. And there is a PDF of this guidance freely available on the AMA manual style website. And we encourage anyone to use the guidance in any way they think they might be helpful. We also encourage feedback because we will be revisiting this on a regular basis. We're now moving on to improving our guidance on for inclusive language and how to address sex and gender and sexuality. And we'll be moving on to socio and economic status after that. Thank you very much.
Well, Annette and Kevin, thank you for really terrific presentations. And let me remind everybody to submit some questions through the Q&A. You can submit them through the chat. We'll see them as well. Or feel free to raise your hands and we can unmute you. We'd like you to turn your cameras on. Annette, I'd like to, here in your presentation, ask you how other journals are also responding to these questions. Has the JAMA Network stepped way out from its peers, or is this going to be that kind of a consistent language for your other peer journals, if you will, at this time?
Yeah, I think we're closely connected with the American Psychological Association APA style guide. which covers a number of sister fields. And we are in tandem. The AP style guide, which is used for the news reporters, is also in tandem with this, and other style guides. So that's something that many journals follow. We are actually, we've been invited to give talks to the Council of Science Editors, the American Medical Writers Association, and with the same idea. I'm giving a talk in a few weeks to the clinical editors of the Nature Springer Journal. So that's a large international body, with the idea that we're all in this together. We're all learning and listening and trying to move forward.
And maybe just one related practical question for prospective authors. Do you think that focusing on language, phrasing, abbreviations will delay the editorial process with submissions?
Oh, no, because we have so many reporting standards. And so this is become higher up in the prioritization list for us. But it's part of our process. I don't know if you know this, but we're sort of a small publisher, and we do everything in-house. We don't cut down the trees for the print journals, but we have our own in-house manuscript editing team, and they're along for the ride here, learning, or just along for the journey and learning how we're going to improve the reporting in terms of race and ethnicity.
Great.
I actually hope it will speed things along, not slow it down.
Fantastic. Kevin, I'm going to throw this question at you and see what your thoughts are. It has to do with best practices that you've seen or that you use to encourage patients to self-identify their race, and then how to document that in the medical record. The audience member says, in our data registries, a common answer is unknown. And how do we change that?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. One of the areas that comes up often is if the data is being extracted from EHR, because a lot of times if patients are followed in a clinical system, when they first establish their care within the system, the very first person who's making point contact with that person is asked to put in a lot of this information. And typically in our system here and other systems I've sort of asked about this, there's usually not a quote unquote hard stop to put anything under race or ethnicity. So if the initial person, and this is outside of research, this is just clinical care, if the initial person making contact with the patient is not asking or soliciting that information, oh, you're from Vietnam, let me write origin Vietnam, what you'll find is the vast majority of the patients in the system are blank or other or not well defined, because again, it's not a hard stop the same way. Unfortunately, maybe your insurance status is a hard stop, right? You won't be seen as a patient unless there's an insurance status put in there. From a specific to research, I think a lot of it comes down to the motivation of the investigators, right? If there's a high emphasis on this question for whatever reason, because you're trying to study a group of individuals from region A versus region B, it just has to be emphasized, whether you're collecting it in traditional case report forms or even asking participants in clinical research. It's something that has to be on the forefront and emphasized by the investigators. And frankly, a lot of research, depending on the questions they're asking, it's often not a high priority question. So usually you're left to race and then kind of the standard categories.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely, Kevin. It would seem as though we should be able to do a lot of retrospective studies on satisfaction of patient care and other things using information that people would presume is in the patient's medical record. But as you said, when we go back, we have the same finding that so much of it is unknown. It's really useless. And you've got a busy registrar who doesn't see their job primarily at that moment in time of collecting that field. And then we lose out on lots of opportunities to learn about how we can do better with our patients who are under our care. Annette, there's a question about whether the JAMA Network has had any discussion with EHR leaders like Epic, Cerner, others on kind of a common dictionary for information such as you presented.
Yeah, great question. No, we have not. Or the controllers of the US Census, which is a whole other problem. We have had conversations with folks at the NIH, at the CDC, and at some other similar agencies in other countries, because they're really dealing with this, and I think in a way that is going to help us all. I should also say several of us are members of the Royal Society of Chemistry commitment to inclusion and diversity in publishing. And this group is really looking at this from a large picture about how to address this in reporting of research, which will end up addressing how it's going to be done in research. But yeah, EHR, that's a great question. Wow.
That's a great opportunity. Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I agree with everything Annette said, and I think the fact that a journal like JAMA has just taken these steps that she has gone through so far, I think a lot of other journals are going to look towards making these changes.
Yes, I agree. There's an observation which I think is really a great opportunity for us to look in the mirror, and that's to do with, should we continue to have the name of our organization as the National Minority Cardiovascular or Health Alliance? Should we have minority in the title of our organization? So I think this is a really good opportunity for us to make sure that we are following best practices. So maybe we'll need to pull our steering committee together sooner than we had planned to. And maybe this is a question for Jessica, or maybe for Annette, I'm not sure. Will we be able to share the slides with audience members?
If the presenters are okay with that, we're happy to share.
Okay, we will discuss with them. Okay, that'd be great. We are at 12:51. I'm looking to see if anyone would like to raise their hand or unmute with a question.
Dr. Kountz, I see a question from Dr. Monroe Hines. May I address it?
Please do.
Okay, so asking, may you please share how receptive authors are to these revisions? That is such a good question. So those of you who are authors, who have ever had to deal with editors like me, your paper goes through these rounds of peer review and then revision, and then it's accepted. And if you're publishing with journals like JAMA or JAMA Cardiology, then goes through a lot of editing. And here's your child here that is now we changed your titles, right, to follow our standards. And so in general, authors are mostly appreciative, but it is always a bit of a negotiation when it comes to specific wording. So if we were to make a change and the authors thought it changed the meaning or thought it wasn't correct, then of course we're going to have a dialogue about that. It doesn't just happen and the authors don't get to see it or prove it. But I think my sense is that the majority of authors are receiving this well and are pleased that we're doing it. Where it becomes a challenge is in opinion pieces. And that's always a negotiation for us. And I'm working on one right now with some authors who want to use a particular term that I'm trying to get them to define. And in the end, it's their paper, it's their words. We'll probably let them have it with the words they want. So thank you for that question. It's a good one.
Great, thank you, Annette. So let me just look around the participants and in our last 5 minutes or so, if anyone has an additional question. If not, I might ask Annette and Kevin to provide us maybe a takeaway point from their presentations. All right, so why don't we do that? And Kevin, I'll start with you.
Sure. I think like you mentioned early on, Dr. Kountz, last couple of years, everyone's thought a lot harder about these issues in general. And I think from a cardiovascular research perspective, a few take-home points would be, if you're involved in research, would be to try to collect more granular information when you're able to put a little bit more of an emphasis on that. And then if you're consuming research, the same. Let's ask more of our professional peers to report this information so we can all learn from each other as we try to make steps forward and doing a little bit better, ultimately to try to help the patients. And thanks everyone for joining today.
Great. Thanks for those comments. Annette, maybe a few takeaways for us?
Yeah, we encourage feedback. So if anyone sees the guidance and has experience or there's something we're missing, my email address, I don't know if it's available, but Jessica could probably share it. Well, I welcome any feedback. We're all in this, eventually, right, to improve public health and patient care. And some of this seems pretty far removed from that, but I think in the end, that's what we're all aiming towards doing. So thank you again. I enjoyed sharing this with both of you.
Well, again, thank you both. I think it's so refreshing to have a physician perspective, but also a non-physician, a journalist perspective. It really enriches our conversations, and really appreciate both of you for joining us. And for those of you who joined us for this hour, I hope that you leave, as I am, with a lot of thoughts, inspired, a little confused, but still, glad to see that our editorial leaders are so focused on this, that our trialists, our clinicians are focused on this. And even though they don't have all the answers, they're really putting themselves out there to do the research, to ask the right questions, to encourage feedback. So those are some of my takeaways from today. Let me also thank Jessica and the National Minority Cardiovascular Alliance for putting on and managing today's program for all of us. Thank you again for joining us, everybody. And I'm going to sign off the call. Have a great weekend. And again, be well, be safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.